people. Finished a book, Captain Sir Richard Francis Burton. This is a wonderful little book. I think I got this. There's no sticker on the front, and there's no price on the inside page. So this must have came from when we were in Michigan, and we went to two libraries, one in Dexter, Michigan, and one in Pinckney, Michigan. So it came from one of those. And Mr. Burton is somebody that I see referenced all the time, and I didn't know much about him. So I don't typically enjoy biographies, but this one got right down to the important stuff. You know, they didn't spend any time on his grandparents. They did his father and his mother a little bit, but you know, by page 50, you're into the important stuff. It was a great book. I just finished it literally minutes ago. I'll get to my notes here. This was written in 1990, 483 pages. My next note there is Burton spoke 29 different languages. Many of those languages, you know, no one else in England, he was an Englishman, no one else in England could speak. He was an explorer. You know, at one point here, I'll get to that note, I tried to write down all the cities that he had visited, but I soon gave up. He was on just about every continent. He was kind of a mystic. He investigated all the different religions, and he seems to have settled on Sufism, which is a Muslim sect. He was a practicing Muslim for a little while. Towards the end of his life, there's documents that claim that he went back to being a Catholic, and that's what his wife, Isabel, she was a Catholic, and she was like a crazy Catholic. But that's kind of mysterious because she at the end wrote a biography of him, and many people disagreed with what was in it. She spent, after Richard Burton died, she spent days and days burning some of his manuscripts. Kind of a crazy woman. The author, the guy's name is Edward Rice. It's typical for me to Google the author and read a little bit about him. He was also an Orientalist, the author, just like Burton was. And one of the quotes from that author was, "Everything I've ever done was leading up to this book here." Fantastic book. Let's see here. Burton has learned all Indian languages, Persian, all the different religions, and he is an officer on special assignment. He's in India. When he first goes to India, 128. When he first goes to India, there is still an army of the East Indian Company. For a while there, you had an army of the East India Company, and you also had an army of Great Britain, both in India. After the Sepoy Rebellion, that changed. And let's see, where the hell am I at? Fourth paragraph, page 128. 1, 2, 3, 4. Napier had thought the brothels were corrupting his troops, white and native alike. In what frame of mind Burton took the assignment is not known. He was a skilled observer, and while some officers might merely have reported that the houses were indeed as rumored and were infecting the troops, Burton gave precise information. In the Nights, he described how boys were preferred over eunuchs because... I'm not going to even read that. One of the things about Burton is he offended Victorian society by talking about sexual practices. Not that anybody in Victorian England wasn't having sex. They were having a lot of sex. Everybody had mistresses, but they just didn't talk about it, and they certainly didn't write about it. And this paragraph here, which I've decided not to finish reading, is one of the reasons that Burton had some enemies throughout his life. He was rumored not only to have investigated these houses of homosexuality in England, but to have taken part in it. And many of his brother officers and people in the diplomatic service could never forgive him for that. Last two paragraphs, page 133. And this is also in India. He's in a lot of areas where England had to fight what they call Queen Victoria's Little Wars, but he was never involved in a large battle. He was in this encampment in Berber or Barrera, something like that, where there was a skirmish, and him and Speke are almost killed, and he actually gets a javelin right through his cheek, coming out the other side. He gets hit in the head with a javelin. It knocks some of his teeth out and puts scars on his cheek. I don't know why. Burton and Scott headed westward again on a ride that was more uncomfortable than interesting. Seiwan, which was believed to have been a former campsite of Alexander the Great's, was a hot, filthy, and most unwholesome place, remarkable for the rascality of its inhabitants, and the abundance of its beggars, devotees, and courtesans. Schwann was among Burton's many baneful experiences. Everything in this place seems to hate us. Even the pet tiger, as he catches sight of our white faces, shakes off the purring little cats that amuse themselves by walking over his broad flanks, springs up, glaring at us with bloodthirsty eyes. That's why I read that about the pet tiger. And here I have a list of some of the places that he had been. Mecca, when he converts to Islam, he actually makes the pilgrimage to Mecca, Medina, Cairo, Harar, Constantinople, Istanbul, Sevastopol, Zanzibar, Halifax, San Francisco, Acapulco, Panama, and then I stopped trying to write down all those places. Speke, the guy's name is spelled S-P-E-K-E, and I have written after that, among multiple other enemies, why, and I've already explained one of the reasons why. The other reason was because he became a Muslim. Nobody could stand that. Speke was also a very interesting guy. They begin as friends, they go on expeditions together, and they end up as enemies. Speke is still credited with discovering the source of the White Nile, that is Lake Victoria, even though Speke never really saw Victoria Falls with his own eyes, but they end up being mortal enemies. They're going to have a series of debates. They have the first one. Speke goes hunting after the first one, and as Speke is crossing a low wall, they figure that he must have laid his shotgun down up against the wall, and then grabbed it by the barrel and pulled it towards him, and he shoots himself in the chest with a shotgun. I think I have those paragraphs marked too. Fernand Poe. Fernand Poe is one of the consulate posts that Burton is assigned to, and he just hates it. Second paragraph page 360. Took me about 2 weeks to read this. And I knew I was going to finish it today, and I already had my book picked out that I'm going to start. Second paragraph. In the capital, Santa Isabel, an unprepossessing town, the name of which did not seem to strike a sympathetic response, that's because his wife's name was Isabel, ennui consumed the populace. The whites were mostly Spaniards, pallid and enervated, who sat listlessly with their chairs propped up against the walls of buildings or lolled about the verandas of their houses. The streets were white-hot, an air of pestilence floated everywhere. Burton had disliked the blacks encountered on his voyage south, but here he took a liking to the local people, the boobs, or boobies, who lived in the wall-less sheds and went naked except for broad-brimmed hats worn as protection against falling tree snakes. Still, he often complained about their insolence. When a nigger dandy entered the consulate and slapped him on the back with what he thought was over-familiarity, he called his canoemen and said, "Hi, crew boys, just throw this nigger out the window, will you?" The crew boys threw the man head first into the street. Everybody at that time who wasn't, who was an Englishman, called anybody who was a little bit darker with skin color a nigger. And he uses that word throughout. The book itself is just sprinkled with Burton's writings. Burton was a little dichotomous because he abhorred slavery, yet he always seemed to feel that the black people were beneath the white people and they should act like it, and the white people should treat them like it. And he seems to get worse the older he gets, which is kind of odd because that's what people here in the United States seem to do. Speak, on his second safari, is missing. And safari, the word safari, actually comes down to us from Burton. Safar is Arabic for to travel or to wander. And Burton is the first one to coin that word. Third paragraph, page 371. The most important person among all the volunteers was Samuel Baker, a Scottish gentleman and sportsman. And when they're talking about the volunteers, these are people who are searching for Speak, who had entered the quest entirely on his own initiative and without any official support. Baker expected that he would encounter Speak and Grant somewhere near Gondoroko. The town was known only by name to Europeans as a notorious and truly evil settlement of slavers and hostile to outsiders. "A perfect hell," said Sam Baker when he entered it. The temperature ran about 100 degrees. The town stank, and crime was a major pastime. Murders were common, and the most powerful slavers had private armies. Baker, a widower, had with him his mistress, and later his wife, a young white woman named Florence Sass, whom he had bought in a slave market in Hungary to keep her from some Turk's harem. Among the other would-be rescuers were 3 Dutch women, the Tynes, extremely wealthy and adventurous, who also hoped to await the missing explorers in Gondoroko. And I Googled the Tynes, and they're a little bit interesting. Second paragraph, page 384. This fucking video is getting a little bit long. 384. The circumstances of Speak's death are ambiguous and will remain so. After leaving the hall the first day, he had gone hunting with his cousin George Fuller and a gamekeeper. He had fired twice at partridges from his gun, a double-barreled breech-loader Lancaster with a safety catch. And this about Speak. He was a big game hunter. He was very familiar with guns. Fuller, about 60 yards from Speak, heard a third shot and looked towards his cousin. Speke was standing on a low stone wall about 2 feet high. Then he toppled over. Fuller rushed to him to find Speke lying on the ground with a gaping wound in his chest. One barrel of the Lancaster had been discharged, the other had not, and the hammer was at half cock. It seemed that Speke had stepped to the top of the wall and had pulled the gun after him, and it had gone off. "Don't move me," said Speke, still conscious. Fuller ran for help, leaving Davis, the gamekeeper, to care for Speke. But by the time he had returned with the surgeon, the wounded man was dead. An inquest, held the same day before a jury of respectable inhabitants of the place, heard the testimony of Fuller, Davis, and the surgeon, and concluded that the shooting had been an accident, though it seemed odd that a man of Speke's experience with weapons should have been so foolish as to pull a loaded gun muzzle first towards himself. The obituary in the London Times 3 days later called Speke a gallant soldier and a sagacious and enterprising traveler, and gave him full credit for discovering the source of the Nile. And then we jump all the way towards almost the end of the book. Burton not only learned all these languages, but Burton uncovered books that were written in other languages and translated them. Burton was one of the first to translate the Arabian Nights, 1001 Arabian Nights. He was also one of the first to translate the Kama Sutra and a couple of other Indian books. I've never read the Kama Sutra, never even opened it up, but I have read parts of 1001 Nights. My wife has a copy of it here. I grew bored with the Nights, and I stopped reading it. Nowhere in here does it mention this curse on 1001 Arabian Nights, and my wife was the only one to ever tell me this. But supposedly if you finish 1001 Arabian Nights, you're going to die within that year. Second paragraph, page 460. The book is very interesting, 1001 Arabian Nights. I mean, it's difficult to read. The origin of the book is very interesting. Virtually every scholar and student of the night has had his or her own views about the origins and the dates of the stories, as well as of the compilers or authors. In the terminal essay, Burton derided Lane for believing that one or two men had written the Nights, and from an analysis of the internal matter, the types of clothing and costumes, the weapons or lack of them, the gun and the cannon, for example, the use of certain foods, wines, cider, and barley beer, and the lack of coffee and tobacco, the types of diseases that afflicted some characters, certain forms of Asiatic cholera were mentioned, and smallpox was known, but not syphilis, and references to various historical figures. Burton was able to state that the body of the work, as it now stands, must have been written before AD 1400. The framework was purely Persian. Some stories may date from the 8th century, some from the 10th, but the major part of the work was put together in the 13th century, with some tales added as late as the 18th century. The author is unknown for the best reason: there never was one, for the Nights are the work of compilers and editors unknown. And then my last note is Isabel Burns' manuscripts. The myth about the Arabian Nights was that there was a king who would behead his bride every day and then take a new bride and behead her the next day. And so the myth goes that a woman that was his new bride came up with all these stories and would not finish the story until the following day, so that the king wouldn't kill her. He wanted to hear the end of the story. That's it. Thanks for watching.